Hi there, I am Monica Burns, and welcome to the new Easy EdTech podcast episode. As a former New York City public school teacher and current EdTech consultant, I started this podcast in 2019 to share my favorite classroom tech integration tips and stories from my experiences. Each episode offers practical ideas for you to try, share, or save for later. Be sure to check out classtechtips.com/podcast for today's show notes and resources. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or another favorite podcast app, you'll find the show notes link in the description too. I'm delighted to have Britannica Professional Learning on board once again as the sponsor for this episode. Their mission: to foster and nurture extraordinary educators, providing them with tailored professional learning strategies designed to help both educators and learners flourish. They're all about activation, enrichment, and growth. Britannica Professional Learning delivers professional development aimed at bolstering teachers' product knowledge, refining their teaching prowess, and stimulating student progress. So why not take your educational practices to the next level? Empower your students and yourself by dropping by britannicaeducation.com. There you'll unearth the multitude of ways they can assist you in reinventing your classroom. This week's episode is titled Power of Pausing: Reflection Activities for Your Classroom with Rachelle Dene Poth, who was a guest on the podcast in the past, but is coming on today to talk about a different topic: activities you can use in your classroom to help students reflect. I've known Rachelle for a number of years now, and we love chatting about all things EdTech when we see one another. The last time was at the conference TCEA in San Antonio, where we got to chat in person. And I'm excited for you to hear us talk today as we share some favorite strategies and tools in a conversation inspired by her recent Edutopia article, which, of course, I'll link out to in the show notes for today. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome back to the Easy EdTech podcast. I am so excited to have you on today to talk about reflection activities. Sometimes we are moving so fast in this EdTech space that I think it's great to pause a bit ourselves to think about activities we can bring into a classroom that highlight reflections. So before we jump into that today, can you share a bit for listeners, remind them who maybe caught the episode we did, I guess, a year or two ago, or maybe listening for the first time? What is your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you. So for anybody who doesn't know me or is just listening in for the first time and hearing me talk, I'm Rachelle Dene Poth, and I do a lot of different things in education, but my biggest role is in the classroom, and I teach Spanish, and I also teach a course in STEAM, What's Next in Emerging Technology, that I love because it's like all things emerging tech, but also some basics like digital citizenship, and it's just fun for me. And then I guess part of my day to day involves working as a consultant as well, but still involved in education and learning and doing a lot of research and exploration just so I can keep on learning and bring new things to my classroom.
Well, I know that you and I talk a lot about those topics, right, of emerging technology, AI. I've seen you speak about creativity in the classroom and all sorts of fun things. I think the last time might have been in Texas for TCEA, where we had a chance to catch up in person. But today, after seeing your article in Edutopia around reflection activities, I thought it would be fun to chat about this topic, especially, as we are finishing up the school year or finished up in some places, as folks might be listening in June or later in the summer. And as we're making plans for the upcoming school year, sometimes this idea of reflection is an afterthought and not something that we're strategic about. And I've definitely been guilty of that too, especially during busy times of the year. So can you tell us about the importance of reflection in the classroom? How does it benefit students' learning experiences?
Yeah, well, I have to laugh whenever I think about certain things I talk about, because there are so many things that I talk about now that I'm doing now in my classroom that I wasn't always doing that I wish I knew the importance of years ago, because I would have started a long time ago. And reflection is one of those things, not just the importance for my students, but for me as an educator, it wasn't part of my daily practice. I mean, I thought about lessons and how I thought they went and things that I did in my classroom, but it wasn't like I was intentionally sitting down and finding ways to kind of go about that. And I had people ask me, like, what are you doing for reflection? I'm like, not really sure, maybe having a conversation or something. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really intentional. But then looking back at my classroom and some of the things I had been doing with my students over the years, I realized like I was having them reflect on learning. I was having them do some different activities that kind of fostered reflection, but I didn't necessarily realize that at the time. It wasn't an intentional part of my practice. And so what I've noticed, especially probably more so as a language teacher in the last, I don't even know, probably 7-8 years now, is how important it is, because learning a language, learning in general, just is difficult. And being able to kind of, especially in a Spanish class, look at where the students are on an individual basis for them to be able to say, yeah, you know what, I really didn't understand how to conjugate verbs, or I had no idea how to write this paragraph in the word order, for example. But now, after I've done these different things in class, or I've put this time in outside of class, or whatever methods they use, being able to look back at that and say, wow, like I see I've made improvement. And this is why I've gotten better at it, or this is what I've changed in my practice as a learner. And then for me as a teacher, of course, doing the same thing and modeling that. But it benefits them on so many different levels. I mean, if we talk about, we could dive into social emotional learning. That's a huge topic. Another thing that I was not totally, real knowledgeable about, but it's a skill that we all need to have, not just in education, but just for, our daily lives and then whatever work we do in the future. And of course, now as educators. And so finding opportunities for students to do that in my classroom and to dive into that with them, I think is really essential.
I appreciate that connection to social emotional learning. It's a topic we've talked about here on the podcast, and something that is so crucial to all the aspects of our life. Like, how many times a day do we need to reflect on our own choices, right? Maybe not, or at least over the course of the week, if something's working or not working, it's an important skill to have. But also, you mentioned this idea of intention and it being a part of that instructional planning, even though we might know that it's important, really carving out time to make sure it happens. So for someone who's listening, who agrees that reflection is important and has a lot of benefits for students, what are some of your favorite activities that promote reflection in your classroom, or ones that maybe you've seen other people do that you think listeners might be able to take back into their own practice?
Well, one thing, and this goes back pre all the tech that we have now, because we have so many options that are out there that it doesn't have to be like one set thing. And I didn't realize it at the time when I was doing this, but like writing in a diary. I mean, just when you were a kid or something, or as an adult, you have a journal and you jot things down, just writing them on paper. I was doing that in my classes for Spanish years ago. I was giving them a prompt and having them write about it. And then also I was giving them feedback. And so that feedback loop. But again, I didn't necessarily go about doing that because I thought, I have to create this practice in my classroom for reflection or social emotional learning. And so blogging became something that I started to do for myself. That again, I didn't even necessarily know what blogging meant. I just thought it sounded like super cool to do. And I was reading blogs. I'm like, hey, I'll give this a go. But then I started to do that with my students and have them write in response to a prompt and then give them some feedback. And then I would have conversations with them after that. Well, what did you learn about yourself? Or what is something that you notice in your writing, for example? So that's just one thing that we've done. And then another thing that I started to do, and here we are on a podcast. Yeah. That's the reason I started doing some podcasting also, was because I was writing blogs about things I was doing in my classroom, which led me to think about, did they work? Did they not work? Okay, how could I do this differently? And then when I started my own podcast, which is basically in most cases me talking to myself and answering my own questions, it really became a way to reflect on what I was doing and to think out loud, and then to go back if I wanted to and listen to it. But it also became a space where others could listen to it. And maybe it was something they were experiencing or an idea they were looking for as well. And so, I mean, those are two things I've done in my class, more so the podcast recently I've done with my STEAM students. And that has been really great for them too, just to be able to talk out loud about their day and what they're experiencing and like the challenges of being in middle school or junior high school, for example. So those two come to mind like right away, because that's kind of how I really dove into it more myself.
And that connection that you made between the analog or the journaling, right, the offline, no tech situation,
right,
to really leveraging EdTech or education technology for implementing reflective activities is so crucial, especially for educators who may have had experience in the past doing something like this without technology. There's a lot of comparisons, that audio version like a podcast, the writing version like a blog. And so I'm curious if you have any favorites. Can you share some specific EdTech tools or platforms that have been particularly helpful in promoting reflection among your students, or that someone else might try out with their group of students?
Yeah, it's hard to narrow them down, because there are so many. And that's what I love about so many of these tools. It's like you might be using one EdTech tool and it's just for one purpose, but you didn't necessarily realize, wow, I can use it for all of these things. And so I think that's what has been really a game changer in my classroom. And one tool that we were using that like my students were every day, they were coming in, can we do this with Spaces is the tool.
Yeah.
And I had a total other lesson plan for them. And then they would come in and say, are we doing something with Spaces today? I'm like, yeah, sure. Let me make something up really quickly. But like, that's a really good example that you can go across and you can have students have an individual space and they could write a blog, or they could record a video, or they could collaborate. I mean, there's so many options. So that became a favorite because, not just for the blogging, but let's say you want students to create like a digital portfolio. They could do that as well. Flip is another favorite that we've used for years. Flipgrid, Flip, whichever my students still, they go back and forth between
Same here. Yeah.
Same thing. But that's another one that has really been great too, especially for students who, that hesitancy, at least in a language course or any class where you feel like I'm going to get the answer wrong, or you're lacking in confidence. It gives you that space to kind of one-on-one with the teacher, and you create that own one where nobody else sees it. So it's moderated. They build that comfort, that confidence, and then they can go back and listen to themselves. And I've had them, because I'm the only Spanish teacher, go back and listen to their videos and they say, I can't believe I pronounced that like that. Or if they look at something they wrote on Spaces, for example, or when we used to use KidBlog for blogging, go back and read it throughout the year and see like where they started, where they are now, how much they've grown over that time. And they're easily accessible, whether they're in the classroom, outside of the classroom. For me as a teacher, being able to access that and give them feedback, like those ones, of course, there are many more that come to mind too. But I think the best thing is when you have just one space, whatever that tool is, that offers a space where even if they want to handwrite and they can just write it down and you can post that picture, like it doesn't always have to be that they're typing it into that space. Being able to have choices, it's awesome with all these tools.
And that's such a great point around, you might have something in your tool belt already that you can use for this activity. You may want to have a few things to give students some choice on how to do this. And of course, you can honor that offline or analog, or I drew this sketch note, or I did something different, right? And even snap a picture and post it in a learning management system or digital space. So, one of the questions I get a lot from educators, I am pretty sure you get this question a lot too from folks that you work with, is not just the how do I make this happen, but when does this happen, right? There's only so much time in the day. And, when you talk about reflection activities, how do you incorporate this into a classroom routine? How often are you doing this with your students?
Yeah, great question, because there's never enough time. And I've become a little bit more, flexible, for lack of a better word to say it, because sometimes, for example, like I wanted my students to do a speaking assessment. And part of that, I wanted them to, there were some different questions for them to answer. How much time do you spend preparing? And what are the ways that you prepare? And, what are some things I should know about your learning, for example? And then, of course, questions in Spanish. But the nice thing is that they can do that from anywhere. And where I would maybe set aside time in class, now you have the flexibility that, like, if the students say, well, I don't want to do this in the classroom, I don't want to do it in the hall where people can see me, they can do that wherever. Sometimes it's been sitting outside at home on their swing in their backyard, and I may or may not see their face, because you know how that goes with the webcam. But it has to be part of, like making it consistent, I think is what was important. And whether you end the week and a Friday and you take the last 5-10 minutes of a class and you ask them to quickly jot something down, record a video over the weekend or something, even if it's not necessarily something that you always see, but maybe it's kind of like a cumulative thing where it's like, okay, you know what? I want you to post like 3 reflective responses over this period of time. And then you go back and check that. Also, when I did learning stations, that was part of one of the stations was like after they did some different activities, okay, where are you now? And answer a couple of quick questions. And like you said, there's no shortage of tools. So you can even use some of those tools out there that have open-ended responses, paper entrance exit ticket with some quick thoughts, takeaways, post-it notes. Everybody gets a stack of post-it notes. Like there's lots of ideas, and it doesn't have to be something that's so time intensive, but it should be made, like you should have that time set aside for whatever amount of time that could be.
And that consistency component is crucial for getting everyone on board, right? Having that same sort of structure. We know this to be true. If you've taught elementary school, right, you know that you need everyone to line up in a certain way or certain commands or, different, things that you might say that we're going to go do this, we're going to go do that, right? And just that sort of routine. And we know that continues into secondary, that this is what we do and this is how it works. And we come back to this piece. So I really love that emphasis on, creating a structure that's going to work for you that you can be consistent with, throughout the school year. So if there's, one thing a listener can do this week to try out what we've talked about today, maybe they're listening in the middle of the school year, or maybe they're winding down or preparing for the upcoming school year. What's one thing they can do? Where should they start?
Yeah, great question. Narrow it down to one, right? I think sometimes we become so overwhelmed because there are so many choices. But I think the key is like, think about the students that you're working with, the time that you have, and maybe there's a tool that you're using. And let's say you've never used it to have students reflect. And so just dive in and say, you know what? We've been using Flip to have conversations or collaborations. So you're going to post a prompt and everybody's going to post a response on Flip. Or maybe it's just paper. Maybe it's trying a new tool that's been on your list and you dive into that. But I think, maybe tomorrow, if tomorrow you have school, go in and save 5 minutes at the end of the class and have students reflect on their learning of that day or from the week prior. Just set aside a couple of minutes and just start there and see how it goes. And then continue to reflect on that and try something different the next time.
I love that idea of layering things on, maybe using this as an opportunity to try out a tool that's been on your list and you just haven't gotten a chance to try yet, or embracing a tool that you can use in multiple ways. So something that hopefully will feel actionable for listeners who want to bring this reflection into their routine. So Rachelle, where can people connect with you? I know you are very present on social channels and a great follow. I encourage everyone to follow along with you. But where can people connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work?
Yeah, so I am very consistent because consistency is important. And so the Instagram and the Twitter and all of the spaces, it's RDENE915. If you want to send me an email, just add the Gmail. If you want to check out my blog site, just put the www and the .com around that and you'll find me, but I would love to connect.
Well, I will make sure to link out to all the things so people can follow along with you as we are chatting and talking on this episode today. So thank you so much for these actionable tips and great ideas for listeners.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It was so much fun chatting with Rachelle today, and I want to finish up like we always do by making this EdTech easy with a couple key points from the episode. Make connections to activities like journaling. Review what tools you already have. Build reflection into your existing routines. And stay consistent with a regular schedule. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from today's episode, including all the ways to connect with Rachelle, on classtechtips.com/podcast and finding today's episode number 219. Thanks so much to Britannica Professional Learning for sponsoring this episode. Their mission to foster and nurture extraordinary educators, providing them with tailored professional learning strategies designed to help both educators and learners flourish. They're all about activation, enrichment, and growth. Britannica Professional Learning delivers professional development aimed at bolstering teachers' product knowledge, refining their teaching prowess, and stimulating student progress. So why not take your educational practices to the next level? Empower your students and yourself by dropping by britannicaeducation.com. There you'll unearth the multitude of ways they can assist you in reinventing your classroom. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday edition of the Easy EdTech podcast. Remember to hit follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite app to have next week's episode ready for you on Tuesday morning. Feel free to share takeaways from this episode with friends or colleagues in a quick email or text, or even on social media. And don't hesitate to tag me at Class Tech Tips if you have any questions.